9 Lives of Trouble, The Familiar's Guide to Choosing Sides, a Hearth and Crust short story, Book 4.5, by Wynne Valentine. Copyright 2025 by Wynne Valentine. All rights reserved. No part of this publication may be reproduced, stored, or transmitted in any form by any means, electronic, mechanical, photocopying, recording, scanning, or otherwise, without written permission from the publisher. It is illegal to copy this book, post it to a website, or distribute it by any other means without permission. This novel is entirely a work of fiction. The names, characters, and incidents portrayed in it are the work of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events or localities is entirely coincidental. Wynne Valentine asserts the moral right to be identified as the author of this work. Designations used by companies to distinguish their products are often claimed as trademarks. All brand names and product names used in this book and on its cover are trade names, service marks, trademarks, and registered trademarks of their respective owners. The publishers and the book are not associated with any product or vendor mentioned in this book. None of the companies referenced within the book have endorsed the book. Book cover by Dana Sacco.
Preface. From the personal, unsolicited, and entirely unrepentant notes of Devil Cat. You can stop looking under the bed. I'm not there. Too dusty. Also rude. If you're reading this, congratulations. You're one of the few creatures in existence who thinks poking their nose into other people's secrets is a good idea. Lucky for you, I'm very nosy, exceptionally well-positioned, and nearly impossible to kill. They think I'm just Mordane's familiar. They're wrong. I'm older than I look, smarter than I act, and hungrier than you should ever want to know. This is not a story about heroes. It's about paw prints in forgotten places, keys that don't belong to you, things that whisper in the walls when everyone else is asleep. 9 lives, 9 chances, 9 doors I probably shouldn't have opened. I watched the inn change. I watched him change. I'm watching you now. Welcome to my version of events. Don't get attached. DC, your problem now. Chapter 1. First Life. What the shadows brought back, in which I am born from failure and immediately regret it. The first thing you should know about being born from someone else's catastrophic magical experiment is that it hurts. The second thing is that you remember everything. Every moment before the transformation, every scream as reality tears itself apart, every desperate prayer that goes unanswered. When Kael Vorath's ritual collapsed in the Whispering Cavern, I felt his scholar's mind fracture like glass against stone. I felt the shadows rush in to fill the cracks. I also felt myself awry. Not born, not summoned, arrived, like a bill you weren't expecting. The cavern reeked of burnt ozone and failure. Kael, though I suppose I should call him Mordane now, shouldn't I? Lay crumpled against the ritual circle's edge, his body wreathed in shadows that moved like they had opinions. His violet eyes, when they finally opened, held the hollow look of someone who'd opened a door expecting a closet and found an abyss instead. Eyes from the deepest patch of darkness, small and sleek and absolutely furious. You'd think being magically created would come with some sort of instruction manual. Perhaps a helpful voice explaining your purpose, your abilities, your reason for existing. Instead, I got hunger. Endless, gnawing hunger for something I couldn't name, and an inexplicable urge to knock things off high shelves. Mordane struggled to his feet, shadows clinging to him like particularly aggressive ivy. When he saw me, his expression shifted through confusion, recognition, and finally something that might have been relief if it wasn't so tainted with despair. "What are you?" he whispered. "Your fault," I didn't say, because I couldn't speak yet. The ability to project sarcasm directly into people's minds would come later, along with several other talents I'm quite proud of. Instead, I padded closer, my obsidian fur drinking in the cavern's dim light. Each step left tiny shadow prints that faded after a heartbeat. When I reached him, I did what any reasonable magical familiar would do. I bit his ankle. Not hard, just enough to establish that while I might be made of his shadows, I wasn't made to be his pet. He jerked back, more surprised than hurt. "You're not normal, obviously." I sat down and began washing my paw with deliberate indifference. "Neither are you, apparently." This would become our dynamic, him making dramatic observations about our situation, me providing pointed commentary through aggressive grooming and strategic placement of dead things. As he gathered his scattered notes and muttered about unforeseen variables, I explored the cavern. The shadows whispered to me. Not words exactly, but impressions. The ritual had been meant to unlock some ancient Veilborn secret hidden in these walls. Instead, it had torn through several layers of reality and left us both fundamentally changed. Wonderful, I thought, discovering I could slip between shadow patches like they were doorways. He wanted power. I got stuck with the cleanup. But as I watched him stumble toward the cavern entrance, I realized something that would define every moment that followed. I could have left. The hunger, the connection, they were strong, but not binding. I chose to follow him into the daylight. Not out of loyalty, out of curiosity. And perhaps, though I'd never admit it aloud, because he looked like he needed someone to bite his ankles when he was being particularly stupid. Which, as it turned out, would be often. The shadows whispered something else as we left the cavern, a name that would become important later, though I didn't know it yet. Hearth and Crust, they murmured. Where the ley lines sing. I filed that away for future investigation. After all, what else are familiars for? End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. Second Life. The Cost of Being Clever, in which I discover that humans are even more insufferable when they think they're making progress. If you've never had the displeasure of watching a shadow-corrupted scholar attempt to regain his humanity through increasingly ridiculous magical experiments, consider yourself fortunate. It's like watching someone try to fix a shattered mirror by hitting it with progressively larger hammers. Mordain had acquired a collection of what he generously called research materials, and what any reasonable creature would call junk someone threw away for good reason. A tarnished compass that pointed to whoever was lying. A music box that played the same 3 discordant notes until you wanted to claw your own ears off. A crystal paperweight that made everything look slightly wrong when you stared through it. Progress, he'd mutter, making notes in that leather journal of his, while Shadow, tendrils, unconsciously wrote duplicate entries in the margins. Small steps toward understanding. I, meanwhile, had discovered something far more interesting than his amateur hour attempts at magical archaeology. The village of Willowmire was fascinating. Not the village itself, mind you. Willowmire was exactly what you'd expect from a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the most exciting event was usually Mrs. Thornbury's roses blooming a week early. But beneath the cobblestones, threading through the foundations like veins through a body, the ley lines hummed with secrets. And at the convergence point, where the magical currents sang their strongest song, sat a cheerfully ramshackle inn that practically reeked of interesting possibilities. The Hearth Crust Inn. My first reconnaissance mission revealed exactly what I'd expected. A collection of well-meaning magical misfits who had somehow stumbled into possession of some genuinely impressive ancient artifacts while remaining blissfully unaware of their actual significance. The orc Draven I learned from my perch in the rafters radiated that particular brand of reformed warrior guilt that made him try to solve every problem by either feeding it or building stronger walls around it. His connection to the inn's foundation stones was impressive, even if he used it primarily for mundane maintenance tasks, such a waste of perfectly good earth magic. The fey baker Amara fluttered around her kitchen like a demented butterfly, chattering to her enchanted rolling pin and leaving trails of flour that sparkled with residual magic. Her pastries weren't just food. They were tiny spell components wrapped in butter and good intentions. Amateur work, but surprisingly effective. Then there was Jill, the brownie whose t-shirt currently read "Warning, contents under pressure," as she attempted to repair a grandfather clock that kept trying to turn itself backward. Her mechanical intuition was extraordinary, even if she insisted on naming her tools and having lengthy conversations with that clockwork raven of hers. But it was the young mage Lenora who truly caught my attention. Not because of her fumbling ward, or the way she muttered encouragement to herself while practicing runes. No, it was that locket of hers. Even from the rafters, I could sense the Veilborn resonance thrumming within it like a caged bird's heartbeat. Veilborn, I thought, settling more comfortably on my beam. Well, the ley lines didn't just hum here. They practically sang. And if I was reading the patterns correctly, this inn wasn't just built over a convergence point. It was built into one, woven through the magical structure, like the keystone of an arch, which meant these charming amateurs were sitting on something that could reshape the entire region's magical infrastructure, if someone knew what they were doing. Someone like, say, a shadow-corrupted scholar with delusions of restoration and a growing collection of minor artifacts that might not be so minor when properly understood. I made my way back to Mordane's temporary workshop, a moldering cottage on the outskirts of town that the locals avoided because it felt unwelcoming. He was hunched over the lying compass, trying to understand why it spun wildly whenever he asked it about his own condition. Because you're lying to yourself, I thought, but didn't bother projecting the observation. He wasn't ready to hear it yet. Instead, I settled on his desk and began grooming my paw with deliberate nonchalance. After a few minutes, he looked up. "Learn anything interesting on your wanderings?" he asked. I paused in my grooming to fix him with a steady stare, then deliberately knocked the crystal paperweight off the desk. It hit the floor with a satisfying clink and rolled under the workbench. "The inn," he said slowly. "You found something at the inn." I resumed washing my paw, let him figure it out. I wasn't his research assistant. But as he bent to retrieve the paperweight, I caught a glimpse of his journal. The page was covered in his careful script, documenting his experiments and theories, and there, in the margin where the shadows had been writing, was a single phrase, repeated over and over in letters that seemed to drink the lamplight. "Hearth and crust, hearth and crust, hearth and crust." Even the shadows found the inn irresistible. I settled down for a nap, purring softly as Mordane began pulling out maps and making new plans. This was going to be interesting, though I made a mental note to keep better track of that rolling pin, something that Chatty was bound to notice when things went missing from the pantry. And I had developed quite an appetite for Amara's honeycakes. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. Third Life, Fish Bones and Echoes, in which I learned that oracles are insufferably cryptic even when they're right. Mordane was becoming predictable, a disappointing development in someone whose entire existence was supposedly dedicated to transcending his current limitations. His experiments grew more frantic, his journal entries more illegible, and his shadow tendrils more prone to knocking things over when he got frustrated. Once in trouble, as well as bringing him, which was often, "The resonance frequencies don't match," he'd mutter, comparing readings from his various artifacts. There's a fundamental harmony I'm missing, a key signature that unlocks the deeper patterns. Yes, I thought, from my perch atop his bookshelf, and it's sitting in a cozy inn being completely wasted on baking enhancement and furniture polish. But I was becoming less interested in Mordane's fumbling attempts at magical archaeology and more fascinated by the forest that surrounded Willowmire, specifically the lake hidden in its heart where something ancient waited beneath waters that reflected more than just sky. The enchanted lake wasn't difficult to find once you knew what to look for. The ley lines converged there like spokes on a wheel, creating currents in the water that moved in patterns too deliberate to be natural, and dwelling in those depths was a creature that the locals whispered about but rarely visited. Eldrin the Wabaglim. Oracle, keeper of reflected truths, and, if my instincts were correct, someone who might actually provide useful information instead of Mordane's endless theorizing. I approached the lake's edge one moonless night when the water was dark enough to serve as a proper mirror for starlight and secrets. The surface remained still until I deliberately dropped a fishbone I'd stolen from Amara's kitchen into the center. Plump. The ripples spread outward in concentric circles that glowed faintly blue, green, and then something vast and flat stirred in the depths. Patterns like moss began to pulse along what I realized was a creature's broad back, and whisker-like appendages emerged to investigate the disturbance. Beep, beep, beep. Another seeks answers in my waters, a voice rumbled from beneath the surface, carrying the weight of centuries and the particular smugness that all oracles seemed to cultivate, though not, I think, for the reasons most suppose. I settled more comfortably at the water's edge and fixed the emerging head with my most unimpressed stare. "You have more than one master," Eldrin continued, his luminescent patterns shifting from peaceful blue to something more urgent, "and fewer than you pretend." Cryptic, how refreshing. But then the water around him began to shimmer, and images formed in the ripples, visions that made my fur stand on end despite myself. I saw Lenora, older, holding something that wasn't quite her familiar locket, but shared its resonance. A key, wreathed in shadows and light, with teeth that seemed to shift depending on which door it was meant to open. The Veil Keeper's key. The vision dissolved, replaced by another. Corridors beneath the inn, deeper than Jill's workshop, older than Draven's foundation stones. Doors that led to elsewhere. And one particular door that didn't want to be opened, sealed with wards that recognized something specific. Something like me. "The Keeper will come seeking what was lost." Eldrin's voice carried an edge of warning now. But some doors were sealed for good reason. Some keys unlock more than their makers intended. The images faded, leaving only the lake's natural darkness and my own reflection staring back from the water's surface. But that reflection held yellow eyes that glowed with a light I hadn't possessed before my creation, and I realized with uncomfortable clarity that Eldrin wasn't just sharing visions. He was sharing a warning. "The ley lines remember," he added, almost conversationally. "They sing of balance disrupted and choices yet to be made. Your shadow-touched friend seeks to restore what was taken from him. But restoration and redemption are not the same thing." I stood, stretching with deliberate casualness, despite the way his words made something cold settle in my chest. Perhaps I projected toward the water, but sometimes destruction serves the same purpose as both. Eldrin's patterns flashed once, bright enough to briefly illuminate the entire lake, and then he sank back into the depths with what might have been amusement. "Indeed," his voice echoed from below. "The question, little shadow, is whether you're destroying the right things." I padded back through the forest, my mind churning with implications. The Veil Keeper's key. doors beneath the inn, wards that would recognize my particular nature. By the time I reached Mordane's cottage, I'd made a decision. He was bent over his journal again, sketching symbols that seemed to writhe in the lamplight. Without ceremony, I hopped onto his desk and deliberately walked across the wet ink, leaving perfect paw prints through his careful diagram. "What?" he started, then stopped as he saw the pattern my prints had created. Not random smudges, but a deliberate modification of his work, a correction that turned his theoretical framework into something that might actually function. "Where did you—" he began, then looked at me more carefully. "What did you find?" I sat down in the middle of his ruined page and began washing my paw, letting him draw his own conclusions. But I was already planning my next reconnaissance mission. This is fascinating, because if there were doors beneath the inn that only I could recognize, that changed everything. And if Eldrin was right about the Veil Keeper's key coming to unlock them, well, some opportunities only presented themselves once per lifetime. Good thing I had several left. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. Fourth Life, A Song Too Sweet, in which I discover that ancient Veilborn magic has terrible taste in music, and I may be more involved in this than I'd prefer. The arrival of Arendor Silversong and his mysterious silk-wrapped package sent the inn's ley lines into what could charitably be called a tizzy. From my new favorite perch in the rafters, conveniently positioned above the common room's main hearth, I watched furniture begin to levitate with musical precision, while the residents scrambled to understand what was happening. "It's singing," Lenora breathed, her locket pulsing in harmony with whatever was hidden beneath Arendor's silk wrapping. Obviously, I thought, the question is why it's singing so bloody loudly. The half-elf unwrapped his burden with theatrical care, revealing a smooth stone that hummed with frequencies that made my whiskers twitch. The singing stone, as they quickly dubbed it, emanated a melody that should have been merely irritating. Ancient magical artifacts usually were. Instead, I found myself listening, not just hearing, actually listening, the way I might attend to Mordane's shadow tendrils when they whispered secrets in languages that predated spoken words. The stone's song carried harmonies within harmonies, and buried in those layers was something that called to whatever I'd become in that ritual cavern. This was problematic. Shadow creatures, and I had no illusions about what I was, typically found Veilborn magic about as pleasant as a bath in holy water. We were antithetical by nature, creation versus entropy, harmony versus chaos. The fact that this particular piece of ancient music made me want to purr was deeply concerning. I dropped silently from the rafters to investigate, padding closer while the inn's residents clustered around Arendor and his stone. Peanut's nose was glowing like a tiny lighthouse, and Cogs was making mechanical chirping sounds that almost matched the stone's rhythm. When I was close enough to truly feel the music rather than simply hear it, something extraordinary happened. The song didn't just continue, it expanded. New harmonies wove themselves into the existing melody, darker threads that complemented rather than contradicted the primary theme. Shadow and light, discord and harmony, all braiding together into something that was somehow more complete than either alone. And everyone in the room turned to stare at me. Did the music just... Jill started, her t-shirt flickering between unexpected variables detected and, well, that's new. Change, Draven finished, his hand moving unconsciously to rest on the foundation stones. It changed when the cat arrived. Lenora's locket was now pulsing so brightly it cast actual shadows, and Peanut had begun making small whimpering sounds that might have been distress or might have been harmony. I couldn't tell which. Fascinating, Arendor murmured, studying me with those violet eyes. The stone has never responded to a shadow-touched creature before. Usually they're incompatible. Usually, I thought, sitting down to wash my paw with deliberate nonchalance. But then, I'm not exactly usual, am I? The stone's song continued to evolve around my presence, weaving shadow, notes through light, melodies until the entire common room resonated with a harmony that was both ancient and entirely new. Even Mordain, lurking somewhere in the forest beyond the inn's wards, would be able to feel this. Which meant my cover as just a familiar was about to become significantly more complicated. Mara emerged from the kitchen, flour-dusted and wide-eyed. "The ovens," she announced, breathlessly. "They're singing, all of them, in harmony with the stone." "The foundation stones are resonating," Draven added, wonder creeping into his usual stoic tone. "I can feel it through the earth magic. The entire inn is becoming part of the song." I could have slipped away then, should have, really. Maintaining my cover required a certain degree of unremarkable behavior, and participating in ancient Veilborn harmonics definitely didn't qualify. Instead, I found myself padding closer to the stone. When I was near enough to touch it, something even more extraordinary occurred. The song didn't just include me, it welcomed me. As if whatever magic had created this artifact had been waiting for precisely this combination. Ancient light and newborn shadow, creation and entropy, all the contradictions that made up my impossible existence. And in that moment of musical recognition, I caught a glimpse of something that made my fur stand on end. Vision carried on the stone's harmonies, corridors of living crystal, chambers where music became architecture, and at the heart of it all, a vast instrument that could reshape reality with the right combination of notes. The Veilborn Music Hall, hidden somewhere in the forest, waiting for someone who could bridge the gap between light and shadow to unlock its deepest secrets. The vision faded, but the song continued, now permanently altered by my presence. I'd become part of whatever the singing stone was meant to accomplish. "Remarkable," Arendor said softly, and I realized he'd been watching my reaction carefully. You're not just a familiar at all, are you?" Before I could decide whether to dignify that with a response, chaos erupted outside. Mordain had finally made his move, drawn by the stone's enhanced song like a moth to a flame. Shadow. Tendrils crashed against the inn's wards, and I felt the moment when his corrupted magic touched the edges of the harmony I'd helped create. The dissonance was unpleasant. But as the inn's residents rushed to defend their home and their mysterious stone, I remained where I was, still close enough to feel the artifact's music thrumming through my bones, because I'd realized something that would change everything. The singing stone hadn't just recognized me, it had been waiting for me, which meant the Veilborn had known, centuries ago, that something like me would eventually exist, had planned for it even. And if they'd planned for my existence, what else had they prepared for? End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. Fifth Life. The Taste of Burnt Sugar, in which I discover that even magical baking can't fix everything, and sometimes the sweetest things hide the darkest truths. The corrupted lantern arrived on a night when the moon hid behind clouds thick enough to muffle starlight. I felt it before I saw it, a wrongness that made my shadow essence recoil like touching ice. The traveler who carried it stumbled through Willowmire's streets, leaving withered flowers and dying grass in their wake. By the time they reached the inn's threshold, I was already positioned in my favorite rafter, watching through yellow eyes that could see the violet patterns crawling across the lantern's brass surface like living infection. Mordain's work, I realized with a mixture of professional interest and personal annoyance. But not his usual style. This was cruder than his typical shadow weaving, more brute force than elegant corruption. It suggested desperation, which made it significantly more dangerous. Desperate mages made mistakes that tended to explode spectacularly. The lantern's presence sent the inn into immediate magical distress. Draven's bracers went cold. Roly began spinning frantically in Amara's hands, whining like a distressed animal. Even Jill's tools started behaving erratically, and her t-shirt couldn't decide between system error and this is fine with increasing panic. But it was Amara's reaction that truly caught my attention. The Fey Baker went pale, her silver-mauve wings flickering with agitation as she stared at the corrupted artifact. It's wrong," she whispered, and I could hear the way the lantern's presence made her voice crack with strain. She was right, of course. The lantern wasn't just magically corrupted, it was inverted. Whatever gentle twilight magic it had once contained had been twisted into something that devoured light instead of creating it, consumed warmth instead of radiating it. And it was making Amara's kitchen magic go absolutely haywire. I descended from the rafters with unusual haste, drawn by an impulse I didn't entirely understand. Amara had retreated to her domain, trying to restore some semblance of normalcy through the ritual of baking, but her usually cheerful kitchen had become a war zone of rebellious ingredients and malfunctioning enchantments. Flour hung in the air like a blizzard. Sugar crystallized into sharp geometric formations that looked nothing like the organic curves Amara usually coaxed from her magic. Her ovens radiated cold instead of heat, and the sourdough starter was making sounds that no bread-based organism should ever produce. "Come on," she pleaded with her rolling pin, which was now vibrating violently enough to blur. "Please, Roly, just work normally. Just for a little while." That's when I made a decision that probably violated every principle of maintaining a low profile. I padded into the kitchen and deliberately knocked over a jar of cinnamon. The spice scattered across the floor in patterns that weren't quite random, and where my paws touched the scattered powder, tiny shadows bloomed like flowers, not the aggressive, consuming shadows that followed Mordain, but something softer. Shadows that complemented rather than competed. Amara stopped pleading with her equipment and stared at me. "You're trying to help," she said, wonder replacing despair in her voice. Obviously, I didn't say. Instead, I padded to the sugar that had crystallized into hostile formations and began deliberately batting at the largest cluster. Where my paws touched the aggressive crystals, they softened, melting back into the granulated sweetness Amara needed. It wasn't that I was fixing the corruption exactly. I was translating it. My shadow essence could interact with Mordain's work in ways that living creatures couldn't, neutralizing the hostile inversions by offering them a different target. "Oh," Amara breathed, understanding dawning. "You're not just any familiar, are you?" I paused in my sugar batting to fix her with a look that clearly conveyed, obviously not, then returned to systematically neutralizing the kitchen's magical rebellion. Working together, though I maintained the fiction that I was simply following feline instincts to knock things over, we managed to restore enough stability for Amara to begin baking again. But these weren't her usual cheerful creations. These pastries carried an edge of defiance, enhanced by my inadvertent shadow work into something that could push back against corruption, rather than simply ignore it. "It protection pastries," she murmured, pulling a tray of dark crusted scones from an oven that had finally consented to produce heat again. "But different. Stronger." I sampled one when she wasn't looking, purely for quality control purposes, naturally, and discovered that it tasted of burnt sugar and starlight, comfort food with an edge of steel. Interesting, I thought. Corruption as seasoning rather than poison. But as Amara's confidence returned and her kitchen settled into its new, shadow-enhanced rhythm, I became aware of something disturbing. The lantern's influence wasn't just affecting the inn's magic randomly. It was learning, adapting, finding ways around the protections and wards that should have contained it. And it was specifically targeting the connections between the residents. The bonds that made them stronger together were being systematically frayed, one small corruption at a time. Through the kitchen window, I could see Lenora struggling with wards that kept collapsing, her locket's light growing dimmer with each failed attempt. Draven stood isolated by foundation stones that no longer sang in harmony with his earth magic. Even Jill's tools were refusing to cooperate, leaving her frustrated and increasingly alone. The lantern wasn't just spreading magical corruption, it was spreading isolation, which meant Mordain wasn't just trying to claim another artifact. He was trying to break the thing that made the inn's defenders most dangerous, their unity. I padded to the kitchen window and stared out at the corrupted light spreading like a stain across the inn's courtyard. Somewhere in the forest, Mordain was undoubtedly monitoring his handiwork, waiting for the moment when the inn's protections fractured enough for him to simply walk in and take whatever he wanted. But he'd made one crucial miscalculation. He'd forgotten that shadows could choose their own masters. And tonight, I was choosing to work with someone who made excellent scones and didn't treat me like a mere extension of her will. Time to show him what happens, I thought, when corruption meets something that was born from it. I hopped down from the windowsill and padded toward the door, pausing only to steal one more scone for the road. After all, fighting corrupted magic was hungry work. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. Sixth Life, Gears in the Floorboards, in which I discover that some books should definitely stay closed, and brownies are far more dangerous than anyone realizes. The ticking started 3 days before Jill found the thing. Not the comfortable, rhythmic ticking of Cog's internal mechanisms, or the grandfather clock that Jill had finally convinced to move forward through time like a civilized timepiece. This was different. Urgent, like a heartbeat that knew something the rest of the body didn't. A dull headache by contrast. I felt it first through the inn's foundation stones, a vibration that made my whiskers twitch with unease. Something deep beneath the basement was stirring, awakening after centuries of slumber. The sensation reminded me uncomfortably of the moment before Kyle's ritual had gone catastrophe wrong. That sense of ancient forces building towards something that shouldn't be disturbed. Draven noticed it too. I caught him pressing his palm against the walls with that particular furrow in his brow that meant the earth magic was telling him things he didn't like. But whatever the stones were whispering to him, he couldn't quite interpret their warnings. Which left it to the brownie with her talent for finding things that were better left alone. I should have been more concerned when Jill's excited shriek echoed from the basement 3 days later. Instead, I found myself drawn downstairs by that same curiosity that had gotten me transformed in the first place. I was napping in a patch of sunlight near the kitchen window when her shriek of discovery echoed from the basement. Not alarm, excitement, the kind of dangerous excitement that brownies got when they found something particularly fascinating to tinker with. By the time I padded downstairs to investigate, she'd already extracted the thing from whatever hideous corner it had been lurking in for the past few centuries. The clockwork grimoire sat on her workbench like a particularly smug toad, all brass gears and copper inlays gleaming in the lamplight. And ticking, always ticking with that rhythm that made something deep in my shadow, essence, want to hide under the nearest large piece of furniture. Look at this craftsmanship, Jill breathed, her T-shirt cycling rapidly between jackpot and what could go wrong with concerning enthusiasm. The gear ratios are mathematically perfect, the binding mechanisms are unlike anything I've ever seen, and the way the magical resonance integrates with the mechanical components. She reached out to touch it. Don't, I projected with enough force to make her hand freeze midway to the book's cover. She looked at me with surprise. What's wrong? It's just a book. A very interesting, mechanically sophisticated book. But the moment her fingertip made contact with the brass binding, every piece of metal in the workshop began to sing. Not literal singing, though that would have been preferable. Instead, every gear, every spring, every tiny screw began to vibrate in harmony with the grimoire's internal rhythm. Cogs went absolutely rigid, his crystal eyes flashing in patterns too rapid to follow. The tools on Jill's workbench started rearranging themselves into geometric formations that hurt to look at directly. And upstairs, I could hear Amara's kitchen erupting into chaos as every pot, pan, and utensil decided to join the impromptu mechanical orchestra. "Oh," Jill said in a very small voice. That's not normal." Obviously, I thought, but I was too busy being fascinated by what the grimoire was doing to properly convey my sarcasm. Because it wasn't just affecting metal objects randomly, it was organizing them, turning chaos into order, random placement into mathematical precision, organic curves into geometric perfection, the kind of systematic restructuring that made my fur stand on end. This wasn't just any ancient artifact. This was Veilborn engineering at its most ambitious and most dangerous. Over the next several hours, as the inn's residents discovered that their magical home had suddenly developed an obsession with right angles and perfect symmetry, I conducted my own investigation. Unlike the inn's residents who were frantically trying to restore order, I could slip through shadows to observe the grimoire's effects from angles they couldn't access. And what I found was both fascinating and deeply alarming. The book wasn't just reorganizing objects. It was rewriting the fundamental magical signatures that governed how they behaved. Amara's rolling pin, which usually followed the flowing organic patterns of fey magic, now moved in precise mathematical spirals. Lenora's practice wards kept reconfiguring themselves into perfect geometric shapes that were technically flawless but felt completely wrong. Even the inn's living furniture was affected, though it seemed to be resisting the changes with what could only be described as architectural stubbornness. But the most disturbing effect was on the ley lines themselves. I could feel them shifting beneath the inn, ancient currents of magical energy being forced into new channels. Not destroyed or corrupted, that would have been Mordane's approach. Instead, they were being improved, made more efficient, more predictable, more controllable. By evening, when Draven gathered everyone in the common room to discuss what they were going to do about their mechanical crisis, I'd reached an uncomfortable conclusion. The clockwork grimoire wasn't just a repository of ancient knowledge. It was a tool for remaking the world according to Veilborn specifications, a magical editing device that could rewrite reality's source code. And Jill, with her brownie intuition for mechanical systems, was the only one who might be able to understand how it worked. Which meant she was also the only one who might be able to stop it before it turned the entire region into a perfectly ordered, mathematically precise, and utterly soulless geometric paradise. "We need to contain it," Draven was saying, his connection to the foundation stones allowing him to feel how the ley line disruptions were spreading beyond the inn. "Lock it away somewhere it can't affect anything else." "But think of what we could learn," Theron protested, his scholar's instincts warring with common sense. "This could be the key to understanding how the Veilborn viewed the relationship between magic and mathematics. The key to understanding how they nearly destroyed everything," Lenora corrected, her locket pulsing with agitated light. "This feels like the thing Eldrin warned us about, the harmony that went too far." I hopped under the table where they'd gathered, positioning myself between them and the basement door. When I had their attention, I deliberately knocked over Amara's teacup, letting the liquid spill in chaotic, organic patterns across the wood. Then I sat in the middle of the spill and began washing my paw with pointedly random movements. "The cat's right," Jill said slowly, understanding dawning. It's not just about order versus chaos, it's about choice. The grimoire doesn't ask if you want your magic reorganized. It just does it. Finally, I thought, someone who understands the real problem. Because the clockwork grimoire wasn't evil, exactly. It was something far worse than evil. It was helpful. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing in the world is something that wants to fix you, whether you need fixing or not. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7, Seventh Life, The Root Beneath the Hearth, in which I discover that basements have basements, and some foundations were meant to stay buried. While the inn's residents spent the following day desperately trying to convince their possessions to behave normally, I conducted a more thorough investigation of what lay beneath their feet. The clockwork grimoire had done more than disrupt the inn's magical ambiance. It had awakened something. I could feel it stirring in the deepest foundations, older than Draven's guardian stones, older perhaps than the inn itself. Veilborn architecture. Not just influenced by Veilborn design, but actual construction. Chambers and corridors that had been hidden beneath layers of newer masonry, forgotten and sealed away until the grimoire's mechanical resonance began calling to its kindred systems. I found the entrance in the wine cellar, behind a rack of bottles that had stood untouched for decades. The shadows there were deeper than they should have been, and when I slipped between them, I discovered that they led down, much further down than should have been possible. The passage was narrow, clearly designed for creatures smaller than the typical human. Brownie-sized, actually, which suggested that Jill's family's connection to this place went back considerably further than anyone realized. The walls were smooth stone inlaid with brass mechanisms that hadn't seen maintenance in centuries but which still hummed with residual power. Dust lay thick on most surfaces, but I noticed something odd as I descended. Occasional disturbances in the accumulation. Scuff marks that were too fresh, too recent. Someone else had been exploring these passages, though not recently enough to have left clear tracks. As I followed corridors that branched and twisted like the roots of some enormous tree, I began to understand what I was exploring. This wasn't just a basement. It was a workshop. A Veilborn engineering facility that had been built into the living rock beneath what would eventually become Willowmire. And at its heart, something was waiting. The central chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in shadows that even my enhanced vision couldn't penetrate. But what I could see made my shadow essence recoil with something approaching awe. By all the forgotten gods, I thought, my tail twitching with involuntary amazement. They actually built it. Machines, not the crude bolts-together contraptions that human engineers produced, but devices that merged magic and mechanics so seamlessly that it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Crystal conduits as thick as my body threaded through brass frameworks that curved like ribs around some mechanical heart. Gear trains the size of carriage wheels moved with their own internal rhythm, turning with a precision that spoke of centuries of uninterrupted operation. Resonance chambers sang with harmonies too complex for any normal creature to fully comprehend. Melodies that made my whiskers vibrate and my shadow essence hum in sympathetic response. This wasn't just engineering. This was artistry. Magic and metal shaped by minds that understood both as facets of the same fundamental force. I padded deeper into the chamber, my paws silent on floors inlaid with geometric patterns that seemed to shift and flow as I moved. Every surface held some marvel of impossible craftsmanship. Crystals that pulsed with captured starlight, brass mechanisms so finely tuned they moved without friction. Control panels covered in symbols that my corrupted nature somehow understood, not through knowledge, but through recognition. This is what Mordain dreams of creating, I realize, but he's a scholar playing with forces he barely comprehends. These builders were something else entirely. The air itself hummed with power barely contained, and I could feel the machinery responding to my presence, not welcoming exactly, but acknowledging, as if it had been waiting for something like me to walk these corridors again. And in the center of it all, a chair. Or perhaps throne was a better term. It was clearly designed for someone to sit in, but the armrests were covered with controls that suggested the occupant would be operating machinery of staggering complexity. The back was fitted with crystal formations that would interface directly with the user's magical essence, creating a direct connection between biological consciousness and mechanical precision. On command center, built to control what exactly? I padded closer, my paws silent on stone floors that still held the faint echo of ancient footsteps. As I approached the throne, hidden mechanisms began to respond to my presence. Crystals flickered to life, gears turned with oiled precision. Somewhere in the darkness above, something large and mechanical unfolded with the sound of wings spreading. And I realized what this place was: the workshop. The facility where the Veilborn had conducted their final, catastrophic experiment. The one that had led to the shattering of the harmony and their civilization's disappearance. The workshop, the facility where the Veilborn had conducted their final, catastrophic experiment. The clockwork grimoire wasn't just some random artifact Jill had stumbled across. It was the manual, the instruction set for operating the machinery that surrounded me. And somewhere in the darkness above my head, that machinery was beginning to wake up. I should have left then. Should have raced back upstairs to warn the others that they were living above a Veilborn doomsday device that was slowly spinning back to life. Instead, I found myself drawn to examine the throne more closely, because something about its design looked familiar. The crystal interfaces were smaller than the other Veilborn machinery I'd observed, more delicate than the massive mechanisms surrounding them, as if they'd been designed for a creature that existed somewhere between the physical and the ethereal. A creature like me, I thought, as understanding crashed over me like ice water. That's why the grimoire responded to my presence. That's why the singing stone welcomed my shadow. Notes. The Veilborn hadn't just known that something like me would eventually exist. They'd planned for it, built their final experiment around the assumption that eventually someone would create a being that could bridge the gap between light and shadow, order and chaos, mechanical precision and organic intuition. They'd been waiting for me. Or rather, they'd been waiting for what I represented, the fusion of opposing forces that could operate their machinery without being consumed by it. And judging by the way the crystal interfaces were beginning to pulse with welcoming light, I was exactly what their ancient systems had been designed to accommodate. The question was, did I want to be? Above me, the inn continued its struggle with increasingly aggressive mechanical reorganization. The clockwork grimoire was systematically rewriting every magical signature in the building, turning organic magic into mathematical precision, chaotic creativity into ordered efficiency. If I activated the machinery around me, I could probably stop it. The throne was clearly designed to control and override the grimoire's programming. I could restore the inn's magic to its natural state. But I'd also be completing the Veilborn's final experiment, activating whatever it was they'd been trying to accomplish when their civilization ended. And something told me that experiment had ended badly for very good reasons. I backed away from the throne, my tail twitching with agitation. This was too important a decision to make alone, and too dangerous to make in haste. The inn's residents needed to know what lay beneath their feet, but warning them would mean revealing exactly how much I understood about Veilborn engineering, knowledge that would raise uncomfortable questions about my own nature. Later, I decided, when I can figure out how to explain this without admitting I'm designed to interface with their doomsday device. But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood freeze. Fresh footprints in the ancient dust, human-sized, recent enough that they hadn't been completely obscured by the settling particles that drifted down from the active machinery above. The scuff marks I'd noticed in the passages hadn't been from some long-ago explorer. Someone else had found this place, and they'd been here within the last few days. Someone who already knew what it was and what it could do. And judging by the faint traces of shadow magic that lingered around those prints, traces that made my whiskers twitch with familiar recognition, I had a very good idea who that someone might be. Mordain, I thought with a mixture of anger and grudging admiration. You magnificent, dangerous fool. Because if he activated this machinery before I could warn the others, well, the clockwork grimoires' systematic reorganization of the inn would be the least of their problems. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. Eighth Life, Shadow in the Mirror, in which I learned that seeing yourself too clearly can be dangerous, and some reflections show more than they should. Mordain's scrying mirror was a masterwork of corrupted crystal and tarnished silver that he'd probably stolen from some hapless divination student. Under normal circumstances, I found his magical espionage both predictable and tedious, another example of his tendency to overcomplicate simple problems. But when he commanded me to observe the inn's magical signatures through dreamwalking, I discovered that spying on sleeping minds was considerably more interesting than watching people fumble with reorganized cutlery. Fine, I projected, settling myself before the mirror's surface. But if this goes wrong, I'm eating your good shoes. The transition into Lenora's dreams was smoother than I'd expected. Her sleeping mind was a landscape of half-formed wards and mathematical equations, anxiety dreams where protective runes kept rearranging themselves into incomprehensible geometric patterns. The clockwork grimoire's influence had followed her even into sleep, turning her magical practice into an endless loop of frustrated precision. I padded through her mental workshop, a dreamscape version of the inn where everything was slightly wrong. The walls breathed with mechanical rhythm. The furniture moved in perfect geometric formations. Even her dream version of Peanut had crystal eyes that ticked like clockwork. Fascinating, I thought. The Grimmer is rewriting her magical instincts at the subconscious level. But as I explored deeper into her sleeping thoughts, I encountered something unexpected. Another presence in the dream, space. Not Lenora's subconscious creating anxiety phantoms, but something else entirely, something that looked exactly like me. Except this other devil cat wasn't the sleek shadow creature I'd become. This version was smaller, softer around the edges, with golden eyes instead of the corrupted yellow I now carried. Its fur held flecks of normal color, brown and black and white, instead of the light-drinking obsidian I'd grown accustomed to. What, I thought, is that supposed to be? The other cat looked up from where it had been batting at dream versions of Lenora's floating runes. When it saw me, its expression shifted through confusion, recognition, and something that might have been sadness. "You don't remember," it said, in a voice that sounded like mine would have if I'd never learned to speak in shadows and sarcasm. "Remember what?" "Before. When you were—" It tilted its head, considering. "When we were just a cat." The dream, the space around us shimmered, and suddenly I was seeing through different eyes, memories that weren't quite memories, experiences that felt both familiar and impossible. A warm kitchen that smelled of bread and herbs. Hands that scratched behind ears with genuine affection instead of absent-minded possession. A name that someone called with fondness rather than commands. Whiskers. My name had been Whiskers. I'd been Cale Vorath's cat long before he became Mordane's Shadecloak, just an ordinary tabby who'd wandered into a scholar's life and decided to stay because the food was good and the reading chair by the fire was perfectly sized for napping. I'd been happy. The memory. Images continued, showing me a version of existence I'd completely forgotten. Lazy afternoons spent purring in patches of sunlight, evenings curled in Cale's lap while he read ancient texts by candlelight. The simple, uncomplicated pleasure of being a beloved pet in a household where learning was valued and kindness was the default. You were there, the golden-eyed cat continued. In the cavern, when everything went wrong, you tried to stop him. Another memory, standing between Cale and the ritual circle, yowling warnings that he couldn't understand. Sensing the wrongness in the magic he was attempting, the way the shadows were gathering with hungry intent. Trying, in the way that cats do, to communicate that this particular course of action was emphatically not advisable. But the shadows came anyway, my former self said sadly, and they took both of us. I stared at this remnant of what I'd been before corruption and shadow magic had remade me into something else entirely. The innocence in those golden eyes was almost unbearable to witness. But more than that, it was tempting. For a moment, I could almost remember what it felt like to exist without the constant hunger that gnawed at my core, without the weight of Mordane's expectations and my own complicity in his schemes, to be wanted for companionship rather than utility. Why are you showing me this? Because you're forgetting why you chose to follow him, it replied. In the beginning, after the transformation, you could have left. The hunger and the connection weren't binding. You chose to stay. Curiosity, I projected, but the word felt hollow even as I thought it, and professional interest in watching him fail spectacularly. No, the golden-eyed cat said gently. You stayed because you remembered loving him, before he became what he is now. You stayed because somewhere under all that shadow and desperation, part of Cale still exists, and you're the only one who remembers what he used to be. The truth of it hit me like ice water. All this time, I'd told myself I followed Mordane out of selfish interest, entertainment, curiosity, the simple feline pleasure of watching someone more powerful than myself make increasingly spectacular mistakes. But underneath all my sardonic observations and deliberate indifference lay something far more uncomfortable. Hope. The foolish, persistent hope that someday the scholar who'd once shared his supper and his reading chair might find his way back from the shadows that had consumed him. Pathetic, I thought. I'm as deluded as he is. The dream space began to fracture around us as Lenora's sleep deepened, mathematical anxiety giving way to the deeper currents of genuine rest. But before the connection broke entirely, my former self fixed me with a look of profound sadness. He's going to activate the machinery, it said. The throne in the depths. He thinks it will restore what he's lost. But it won't bring back what we were. It will only make what we've become more permanent. Then why are you telling me this? Because you still have a choice, it replied, as the dream dissolved around us. You can choose who to save, and from what. The transition back to Mordane's workshop was jarring, like being yanked from warm sunlight into ice water. I found myself staring at my own reflection in the scrying mirror, disoriented by the contrast between the golden-eyed innocence I'd just witnessed and the yellow-eyed corruption that stared back. But for just a moment, I could swear I saw golden eyes looking back at me instead of corrupted yellow. Mordane was bent over his journal, frantically scribbling notes about what he'd observed through our connection. Remarkable, he muttered. The inn's foundation extends much deeper than suspected, And the resonance patterns. There's definitely Veilborn architecture beneath the surface level. He looked up at me with those unsettling violet eyes. You performed admirably, he said, and I caught just the faintest echo of the fondness Cale used to show when I'd brought him a particularly interesting dead mouse. Don't, I thought fiercely, don't you dare make me remember caring about you. But it was too late. The golden-eyed cat in Lenora's dream had shown me something I'd been trying very hard to forget. The reason I'd originally chosen to follow this shadow, corrupted scholar wasn't entirely selfish. Somewhere beneath all the dramatic pronouncements and megalomaniacal scheming, a small part of Cale Vorath still existed, the part that had once shared his reading chair and his supper and his quiet contentment with simple scholarly life. And that part was the reason I was about to do something monumentally stupid. Or, whispered a darker voice in my mind, the reason you're about to finally abandon him to the consequences of his choices. Because that was the real question, wasn't it? Not whether some remnant of Cale still existed. I'd felt it in rare, unguarded moments when exhaustion made Mordaine's defenses slip. The question was whether that remnant was worth the destruction he was about to unleash. The inn's residents were good people, flawed certainly. Draven carried too much guilt. Amara worried too much about everything. Jill took risks that bordered on suicidal, and Lenora was still figuring out how to trust her own power. But they were trying to protect something worth protecting, trying to build rather than tear down. When had I started thinking of them as more than amusing distractions, I wondered? When had their small kindnesses, Amara's absent-minded offerings of pastry crumbs, Jill's casual conversation with her tools, Draven's quiet moments of checking the inn's protections, become something I looked forward to observing? I'd told myself I was simply gathering intelligence, studying potential obstacles to Mordaine's plans. But somewhere along the way, their stubborn determination to protect each other had become appealing. The way they chose cooperation over dominance, preservation over possession. While Mordaine was trying to remake the world to fix himself. And I was the only one positioned to tip the scales one way or the other. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9. Ninth Life. The door that doesn't open, in which I make a choice that surprises everyone, especially myself, and discover that some doors are closed for everyone's protection. The final confrontation began, as these things usually do, with Mordaine dramatically miscalculating how much resistance he'd encounter. He materialized from shadows in the inn's basement just as Jill was attempting to convince the clockwork grimoire to stop reorganizing reality according to mathematical principles. His entrance was appropriately theatrical, shadow tendrils writhing, violet eyes blazing, the whole performance designed to intimidate and distract. "Surrender the grimoire," he announced, because apparently scholarly transformation doesn't cure you of loving the sound of your own voice. You cannot comprehend the forces you're meddling with. Actually, I thought, from my perch on Jill's workbench, they're doing remarkably well considering they have no idea what they're dealing with. Draven immediately moved to shield the others, his Earthshaper's bracers flaring as he drew power from the foundation stones. Amara clutched Rolly like a weapon, her fey magic crackling with protective intent. Lenora's locket blazed bright enough to cast actual shadows, and Peanut's nose was glowing like a tiny lighthouse. Even Cogs had positioned himself defensively, his crystal eyes cycling through threat assessment patterns. "We're not surrendering anything," Jill declared, her t-shirt flickering between "over my dead body" and "bring it on" with admirable consistency. Especially not to someone who thinks corrupting ancient artifacts is a reasonable hobby. Mordaine's expression shifted to that particular blend of condescension and impatience that I remembered from Cale's days dealing with especially dim students. "You understand nothing of what you possess. That book is the key to remaking magical reality itself. In the right hands, it could restore balance to forces that have been chaotic for centuries. In the right hands, I thought, it could also turn the entire world into a perfectly ordered, mathematically precise wasteland where nothing spontaneous or beautiful could ever exist again. With a shudder, tendrils lashed out toward the grimoire, and the inn's defenders rallied to protect it. I made a decision that surprised everyone present, including myself. This is it, I thought, feeling something cold and final settle in my chest. Choose. The throne below waited with its welcoming crystal interfaces, promising power enough to override the grimoire, to control forces that could reshape reality itself. All I had to do was descend, take my place at the heart of the Veilborn machinery, and I could grant Mordain everything he'd ever wanted. Or, whispered the memory of golden eyes and innocent contentment, I could choose differently. I looked at Jill, frantically trying to shield the clockwork grimoire with her body while Cogs positioned himself protectively beside her. At Draven, earth magic flaring as he prepared to face shadow corruption with nothing but determination and protective instinct. At Amara, clutching her rolling pin like a weapon while her fey magic crackled with terrified courage. These people weren't perfect. They were small and flawed and completely unprepared for the forces they were meddling with. But they were trying to protect something good, trying to preserve rather than possess. While Mordain wanted to fix the world by breaking it first. I left, not fled. That would have been simple cowardice. I deliberately abandoned my position and padded toward the basement stairs, leaving Mordain to face the inn's residents alone. "Devil Cat," he called, genuine alarm breaking through his theatrical composure. "Where are you going?" I paused at the base of the stairs and looked back at him. For just a moment, I let him see something other than sardonic indifference in my yellow eyes. "I'm choosing," I projected clearly enough for everyone present to feel it. "And I'm not choosing you." Then I descended deeper into the inn's foundations, following passages that led to chambers that predated human occupation by centuries. Behind me I could hear the sounds of magical combat as shadow tendrils met protective wards and brownie engineering clashed with corrupted scholarship. But I had more important business in the deeper darkness. The Veilborn workshop waited exactly as I'd left it, machinery humming with increasing urgency as the clockwork grimoire's influence spread through the inn's magical systems. The throne at the chamber's heart pulsed with welcoming light, crystal interfaces adjusting themselves to accommodate my specific dimensional requirements. All I have to do, I thought, is sit down, interface with the machinery, take control of the grimoire's programming and shut it down. Simple, direct, and absolutely guaranteed to complete whatever catastrophic experiment the Veilborn had been conducting when their civilization ended. Instead, I padded past the throne to investigate something I'd noticed during my earlier exploration. A door, almost hidden in the chamber's far wall, that radiated an entirely different kind of magical signature. Not Veilborn engineering, something older, something that felt like choice. The door was plain wood, dark with age, bound with iron that had gone black with oxidation. No crystal interfaces or brass mechanisms, no invitation to activation or promises of power. Just a door that had been sealed with magic that recognized exactly what I was and had decided quite firmly that I wasn't allowed through. Fascinating, I thought, pressing my paw against the wood. What's behind there that even shadow-corrupted familiar cats aren't supposed to see? The answer came as vision rather than words, flooding my consciousness with images that made my fur stand on end. Corridors of living crystal that sang with harmonies too pure for corrupted ears to bear. Chambers where light and shadow danced together in perfect balance, neither consuming nor being consumed. And at the heart of it all, a presence that felt like the answer to every question I'd never known I was asking. The heart of harmony whispered something that might have been the door itself, where the Veilborn learned that true balance cannot be engineered, only chosen. And you won't let me in because you carry too much shadow, it replied sadly. Not by choice, but by creation. And this place exists for those who have found their way back to the light they thought they'd lost. I understood then why the door had sealed itself against me, not as punishment, but as protection. There were some kinds of healing that couldn't be forced, some forms of redemption that had to be earned rather than simply claimed. And I wasn't there yet. But the presence behind the door added gently, choice itself is a form of light, and you have chosen well today. The sounds of combat from above were growing more intense. Through my connection to the inn's foundations, I could feel Mordain pressing his attack, driven by desperation and the growing certainty that he was running out of opportunities to claim the power he believed would restore him. I looked one last time at the throne with its welcoming crystal interfaces, then at the door that wouldn't open for me. Not yet, I thought, but maybe someday. Then I turned and padded back toward the stairs, toward a battle where my choice would mean more than my power, and where helping the right side mattered more than being on the winning one. Emerged into chaos. Mordain's shadow tendrils had wrapped around half the basement, and the clockwork grimoire was spinning its gears so rapidly they blurred. Jill was shouting something about containment protocols while cogs projected defensive light patterns. Draven had his hands pressed against the foundation stones, trying to keep the inn's structure stable as reality warped around them. Time to make my allegiance clear, I thought. My claws behind Mordain and did something I'd never done before. I attacked him, not playfully, not as a distraction, but with genuine intent to disrupt. My claws found the shadow conduits that connected him to his tendrils. My teeth closed on the leather binding of his journal, and my presence, corrupted though it was, created enough magical interference to make his control falter. "Devil cat," he roared, spinning to face me. "What are you?" "I'm choosing," I projected with crystal clarity, then deliberately knocked his shadow-focused crystal off the workbench. It shattered against the stone floor with a sound like breaking promises. Because sometimes the most important door is the one you choose not to open. And sometimes the greatest victory is admitting that you're not ready for what lies on the other side. End of Chapter 9. To be continued.
Thank you for listening. Please visit me at winvalentine.com to stay up to date. Please subscribe, leave a comment, and review.